Hello, I'm Kevin Hong. I'm a partner at LYC Partners, an executive search and leadership advisory firm. I'm also the co-founder of The Council, a private network for senior executives. And this is Leaders in Motion. Welcome to Leaders in Motion. Today I'm joined by Justin Sargent, a global business leader and advisor whose career has spanned Europe, Asia, and Australia. Justin started his career at Procter & Gamble in marketing before spending over 2 decades with Nielsen and then Nielsen IQ, where he led a series of senior international roles. He led business across multiple regions, including heading a team around 10,000 people in Asia Pacific, and later took responsibility for the global commercial strategy of a $4 billion enterprise following Nielsen merger with JFK. Today, Justin is based in Singapore, where he runs Justin Sargent Advisory, working with boards, CEOs, and leadership teams around the world. His focus, helping organizations and their people reach their full potential by putting cultural intelligence at the center of leadership and growth. In this conversation, we will explore themes from Justin's new book, Beyond Borders, Beyond Belief, a global journey of learning, leadership, and laughter across cultures. We will talk about how a snap decision on a rainy English motorway led to a 25-year journey across 6 countries, what he has learned about leading across cultures, and why humility and curiosity might be some of the most powerful leadership tools we have. Justin, welcome to Leaders in Motion.
Thank you, Kevin. Absolutely delighted to be here to talk to you about these topics.
Justin, it is great to finally have you on the podcast. And just how are you feeling now that book is being launched? You spent a few months, as you were telling me, on the book. How is the current feeling at this stage of the journey?
Yeah, look, I'm feeling really good. I mean, it's this was a new journey for me, actually writing a book. As you pointed out, my career has been very much in corporate and advisory roles. So writing a book was out of my comfort zone. So I've been sort of doing it for 7 or 8 months. The motivation very much was I just had lots of questions over my career about what have I learned about leadership and culture, throughout my sort of travels and working around the world. So I felt like there was a book inside me, and I've been chipping away at it the last 7 or 8 months, and it finally got published very recently. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to hearing what people think and obviously discussing some of the topics in the book. So yeah, so I'm feeling excited and good.
Great. In the little excerpt that I have read, it started with the origin story of how you decided to move to different country. So maybe you can take us back and what is the origin story? Why you decided at the time, and what was the context? What was the mindset when you decided? Well, that was the beginning of everything, right? That unfolded.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of it's one of those moments in time that I just remember really clearly. And I know a lot of people have sort of memories they can remember really clearly about things that happened or decisions they got, that they made. And I was on the motorway in England. It was pouring with rain. I was working for Nielsen at the time, based out of Oxford. I've been sort of a few years into my career. It was going pretty well, my career. I've got a few promotions. But on this particular occasion, I'd sort of been down to the south coast of England to meet a client. I've been pitching a project. And whilst they were very polite, I sort of knew in my heart of hearts it wasn't going to go ahead. So I was stuck in this traffic jam in the rain on the way back, thinking about what next. And I'd had a conversation with the marketing director of Nielsen in Australia a few days previously, who basically said to me there was a role available. And I remember clearly sitting in the traffic thinking, right, this is it. I'm going to take this opportunity. And some of it obviously was probably driven by the weather and thinking there must be a sunnier place in the world to actually go and live. But a lot of it was also, just this desire to go and experience something different, to learn something new, get to know a different culture and sort of see where things went from there. So, yeah, it was one of those sort of snapshot memories that is always going to be emblazoned on my mind forever, probably.
And which country and where did you go when you started your career abroad? What was the first expatriation country then?
Yeah, look, first one was from UK to Australia. I was sort of in my late 20s at the time. I'd actually never been to Australia before, but I'd always heard lots of fantastic things about it. And I guess as a sort of 20-something-year-old, the idea of going and living in a place like Australia was quite appealing. So look, it was probably one of the easier international assignments to start with, and we can talk a bit more about some of the other assignments I've had, throughout this conversation. But nevertheless, it was a long way away from the UK. A 23-hour flight, a long way away from family, a long way away from friends. So it's still quite a leap. But yeah, no one has anything bad to say about Sydney. So I was eager to get there and also, start showing what I could do, because one of the motivations for me was I was part of a team in the UK. Australia, being a smaller country, was asking me to lead a team. So I was actually going to get some career learning as well, from being a team member to a team leader. And that was also exciting, aside from the personal aspirations as well.
Looking back now, 20 years later, obviously after your stint in India, China, now Singapore, obviously you might think Australia is also very similar to the UK culturally, but I'm sure that you might have encountered some culture shock even back then, even if it was only Australia.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I remember thinking at the time, this is completely different to the UK. And then I think as I went throughout my career and lived in places like India and China, I tempered my views a little bit. I felt, okay, there's maybe a few more similarities here than I felt at the time. But certainly at the time when I got there, it did feel very different. One of the immediate things that strikes you when you go to Australia from Britain is just the informality. In the UK, particularly in a business context, it was, sort of quite professional, very polite, quite reserved, respectful. Whereas, the first time you get into an Australian, business, all the shackles are off, so to speak. People are very direct, like to swear a lot. The beer trolley used to come around at 4 p.m. on a Friday, which it never would have done. In UK, it's less so in Australia, in fairness, nowadays as well. But, that whole informality really, really shone through. So yeah, I found there are a lot of differences straight away that I had to get used to. In those days, banter was obviously a big thing. 20-year-old as well. So, Australians' love of sport came through, and I was on the brunt, I guess, of some of the joking around. But I've got great memories of it, I must admit. But there was certainly some adaptation to some of the different styles of getting things done in Australia versus a slightly more formal UK workplace.
And coming back to the professional aspects, can you tell us a little bit more about what you think you have achieved in Australia, whether or not this is where you also started to build some key learnings when it comes to leadership? You manage a team, like you mentioned. So anything related to that?
Sure. I mean, when I went there, I was leading a team, a relatively small team, but it was my first experience of people management. It's always a big leap for anyone, I think, going from sort of managing yourself, being part of a team, to suddenly being responsible and accountable for other people. So I learned a lot, even in a small team environment, about how do you create cohesion, get the right people in the right roles, how do you motivate them, how do you get them excited about the future. I took on bigger roles throughout my years in Australia as well. So I went from leading a 5-man team originally, 5-person team, I should say, to over 100 people by the time I left. So I learned a lot as well about how you need to change your communication style. When you're leading a small team, then naturally you can lean heavily into one-on-one conversations and individual motivations, whereas when you're leading 100 people, you can't do that. You have to really focus on the bigger messages, sort of working with your leaders to cascade in the right way. And you're never quite sure whether that communication is always getting through in the right manner. So I learned a lot in that time period about, sort of communication. And that's actually one of the key things that stuck with me throughout my career, that, sort of lots and lots of people can be great at what they do, but if you don't communicate in the right way, tell people what you're doing, tell people what you expect, then often careers can stall, not because you're not capable, but because you haven't spent enough time on the communication side of things. So that is one of the big learnings that came through to me in Australia that has really stuck with me throughout the rest of my career.
That's really insightful. And then I assume that led to a promotion, and whether or not it led to another country. Have you ever thought about moving back to the UK? Have you been offered to move back to the UK at that point? It won't be no spoiling that to say that there were other countries on the line as well.
Yeah. Well, look, when I first went to Australia, I thought it was going to be for a couple of years, but I had such a great time and was given more and more responsibility, I actually ended up spending 6 years in Australia. And by the time 6 years came up, I was sort of thirsty, if you like, for some other international experiences. And I was almost willing to go anywhere in the world at that stage. But ironically, and slightly disappointingly for me originally, honestly, they actually asked me to move back to the UK. They felt that what I'd learned in Australia, I could lead the UK business effectively, sit in the commercial team, and then became the MD. So to start with, I wasn't really keen, honestly. I'd sort of moved, I'd had the difficult conversations with family about moving away, and I felt I should go somewhere else. But the business was quite convinced they wanted me back, and it was a bigger role. It led to me leading the UK business, which is one of Nielsen's biggest markets. So I did go back there, but to be honest, I went back there with an eye on this being a bit of a stepping stone into somewhere else. So, throughout that journey after the UK, then, India opportunity came along, which is obviously very, very different. And, it didn't take me too long to say yes, because, I viewed my step back to the UK, my trip back to the UK as a bit of a stepping stone in that international.
Before we dig into your India experience, I think it will be very fascinating and interesting. How did that opportunity of India came up, and why the company thought of you? Eventually, how did it unfold?
Yeah, well, that's a pretty interesting story, because I was running the UK business and I was invited on the Global Leadership Program, which was one of the marquee leadership programs at Nielsen. It happened once a year. And it was about 30 people from around the business. So I was invited on that. The first week was in New York, so in US. So I went over there and spent a good week. And then the second week, they actually put it in India, which was the first time ever the company had done the second week in India. And they did it because India was a big focus for the business. It was a big developing market. So I went to India, to Bangalore. Again, I spent the week there. The global CEO and his team came down because that's what they did. So we had an assignment to do, which I ended up presenting for my team. And the assignment was simply, if you were leading India, what would you do to drive the business? So a very targeted question. I delivered our team's presentation, and it went very well, it has to be said. So at the end of the course that evening, we were literally relaxing, having a drink in the bar, and the global CEO was there. And I was speaking to him, and he said, "Justin, I was really impressed with what you said today. So impressed that I'd like you to move to India." And that was it. I almost spluttered my beer out all over him, which probably would not have been a good move. But that was it. And then suddenly the global head of HR was around. He was, arms around the shoulder. He was like my best friend in the world. So, of course, all of this had been planned unbeknownst to me. But they did pitch it, to me in, in a couple of ways. One is I sort of needed a little bit of a change. I'd gone through some personal tragedy in my life. My wife had passed away, and I think they knew, even if I didn't, that I needed probably a change of environment, which was quite smart of them, I think. And secondly, they were quite clear that I could play bigger global leadership roles in the future, but they said that you have to have developing markets experience. You've had Australia, you've had UK. They're not really developing. So you need to go somewhere. And of course, India was the ultimate developing market. So they said, go to India, you'll learn tons about developing markets, and that will stand you in much better stead to be a more competent global leader in the future. So they were very thoughtful about it and very convincing. As I say, it didn't take very long for me to say yes, even though, again, I knew this was going to be a huge step for me out of my comfort zone.
With India, I would like to start first with the end. What were your key learnings in India? The things that impressed you, the things that were the most challenging, and the things that you kept until today?
One of my immediate impressions in India, which stayed with me throughout, was that there is so much opportunity around. It's really being quite clever and clear about where do you want to place your bets and which opportunities do you really want to get after. That was slightly different to my UK experience, which was a tougher market. You thought a lot more about productivity and cost and, how could you control the profit. In India, it was all about top line growth. I had to change my mindset very much in terms of just thinking a lot bigger than I had historically. In the UK, if I grew the business 4 or 5%, I was almost a hero. In India, if you're growing at less than 10, 15%, it was like, what were you doing? So that was a really, really big shift for me. With that came challenges because there was a hugely talented team in India that sort of really wanted to do lots and lots of different stuff, but they were sort of all over the shop, if you know what I mean. So a big challenge in India as well for me at the time was how do you sort of bring people together around a single vision? How do you sort of make sure they stay the course? And how do you make sure there isn't too much distraction on things that sound quite interesting, but, are going to dilute the effort as well. So a lot of the challenge in India was getting what I call the say-do ratio very high, because there is a bit of a reputation in India, a bit unfair, I think, but sometimes people say stuff, but it doesn't get done. So I think just making sure that sort of say-do ratio was really high, and everyone could sort of, take part in the rewards and celebrations that occurred as a result. So those are really big factors for me. And of course, one of the things I learned in India, which became very relevant, particularly in China and, a lot of Asia assignments, is that I realized the importance of relationships and building trust. I would say probably in Australia and UK, clearly relationships are very important as well, but you don't have to build relationships necessarily to get things done. In India, you have to take the time, invest, sort of some serious effort to build relationships, build trust. And if you do that, then people will go the extra mile. They'll want to work for you. They'll find ways of making things happen. So I learned a lot that you've got to sort of lower the guard, be less reserved, be prepared to embarrass yourself if need be, but lean into those relationships because they will pay massive dividends in the future. So those are a few of the learnings that really came out very, very strongly through my India experience.
In every leadership stories, we often see a moment of friction with colleague, but then in the end, when overcome that situation, the two becomes buddies and they build that trust. Do you have any specific stories to share?
When I first went to India, I remember one of my team, Prashant, he gave me a book called The Argumentative Indian. And I didn't really understand why he was giving it to me. I thought, oh my gosh, is this guy going to be trouble? But actually, he was giving it me to give me a bit of understanding of history and culture in India, but also make exactly the point that you're making, that sort of people love to debate, they love to fight verbally, but then they make friends. But you have to get ready for this. And I saw that on plenty of occasions, sort of very big disagreements within teams, even with clients. I would see, interestingly, sort of, what appeared to be sort of scenarios that in the UK, frankly, probably no one would have spoken to each other for a long time after that. But in India, 10 minutes later, it was forgotten. You just had to get it off your chest. So that was very interesting, actually, sort of seeing that passion come through. But people don't take it too seriously. They know that it's a heat of the moment, and it's a way of sometimes getting your point across and getting things done. So you've got to be a little bit thick-skinned, certainly, when it comes to it.
Interesting. And how did you then, as a multinational company in India, very different markets, how did you manage to find relevance locally?
Yes, I mean, India clearly is a dramatically different market to certainly the UK and Australia and, most of Western Europe and US. That the scale is mind-boggling, population of 1.5 billion people, almost 1.5 billion people now. All the states are the size of individual countries in Europe. So first of all, getting my head around that was a big challenge. I also found that, I should not pretend to be the expert, because the reality is I have very talented team members in India, and they're not looking for me to know more about India than them. They're looking for me to help them sort of make some prioritization decisions, and also frankly bridge their knowledge with global headquarters. And I found that was a really, really big thing in India, because a lot of people had amazing ideas. They knew what to do. I didn't really have to tell them necessarily how do you do something, but they didn't know necessarily how to get support for those ideas. So I found myself spending a lot of time almost being the bridge between global HQ and India. So helping the team in India pitch their ideas in the right way, finesse them, sort of make sure that, sort of they could present them in the right way to get support from global HQ. And vice versa, I found myself spending a lot of time with global HQ, just explaining why India is so different and why a product that works in the US is just not going to work in India. So that was a lot of my role, honestly, in India. Eventually you end up on a few big bets as well. With our business, we made some very big bets in terms of expanding our service dramatically into rural areas. For example, we were predominantly urban at the time, whereas a lot of the growth is coming from rural. So that was a huge investment for the company. And that's where I spent a lot of my time, making sure that global headquarters understood and gave us the budget, frankly, to be able to make those sorts of bets. So I think leaders in India in particular have to really think about not necessarily being the expert, but being a great bridge and being a great coach for a lot of talent in the country.
Do you have any specific examples where there is a great idea stemming from one of your team member, but potentially, or maybe it even happened that if that person is connecting directly to global, the idea won't fly, and this is where you stepped in, and concretely speaking, how did you help?
There are plenty of examples. I mean, global headquarters are always interested in India, so they won't always go through the leader, as you say. They will reach out to individuals, and individuals, frankly, want the relationship with HQ as well, and that's good generally because you want to open up access to the team, and you want headquarters to see your great people in the market. The downside, as you say, is that things can get positioned in not necessarily the smartest of ways. So we did have a few examples of products that were very India specific. They were very analytical. They were meeting the needs of some clients, but they weren't scalable. So a lot of the headquarters rationale was, we don't mind supporting stuff in India as long as it works in India, but we'd like to see that at some point it could be scalable into other markets around the world, particularly developing markets. So I did find some examples where the team were pitching ideas that were right for India, but they weren't going to be profitable enough, and they certainly weren't going to be scalable enough in the future. And with sort of limited resource pools available globally to support different markets, we didn't really want those resources working on things that weren't scalable. So that was an example where I had to do a fair bit of coaching and almost catch it a bit after the fact and just explain a little bit. It's a great idea, don't get me wrong, but it's not necessarily right, for this particular instance. Or let's recut it in a different way so that it can be more scalable for developing markets. And that's the way that we can get some support. So yeah, I think constantly thinking about it from two angles, both what are global thinking and what are the team in India thinking, and trying to find a way of bringing those viewpoints together. I think that's a lot of the key of managing teams in India.
As well, that your time in India has been viewed as a success, and therefore came another opportunity to another country. Maybe quickly, how did that happen? Again, one more time, and which country was it?
Sure. Yeah, thankfully, my time in India went very well. I was there 3.5 years in the end. I was loving my time there. We had rapid growth, over that time. We had 15 to 20% top line growth. So the company was very happy. Part of me wanted to stay in India. Honestly, I'd built so many friendships and was loving the place. I'd actually met my wife, through that process as well, or my to-be wife anyway. But by the same token, I felt, look, 3.5 years, I've got to keep on learning as well. So I actually started sticking up my hand and sort of saying, look, I'm ready and open to whatever the next assignment is. And by this stage, I'd run, Australia, or most of Australia, UK, and India. So I started thinking I could do another country leadership role, but actually I probably need to learn some new stuff myself. So I felt that running a global virtual team would be the right next learning stage in my career. So I started looking at opportunities in that space, and I eventually settled on the idea that I'd like to run a global client relationship for Nielsen, and I'd like to run a global client that wasn't just very central, it was actually decentralized, so I could travel and get to know different cultures. And I felt Nestle would be that right client. So I rang up the guy who was running Nestle. I knew him well. Pat Dodd was his name. And I sort of said, look, Pat, I'm not sure when you're ready to move on, but I would love to do your role. And he was a bit surprised. Who's this cheeky guy ringing me up, sort of saying, when are you ready to move on? But he remembered me, obviously. He knew me anyway. And a few months later, sure enough, he was taking on his next big role, and his role became vacant. So I was able to take on that Nestle global client leadership role, which meant that I moved to Switzerland, which, as you can imagine, is very, very different to India. Possibly the exact opposite of India in many, many respects. So that was a huge cultural shock. But yeah, I found myself after 3.5 years in India, packing up the bags and heading off to Lausanne, which is just outside Geneva in Switzerland.
Interesting. And how did you adapt, and potentially how did you feel? You felt like moving to another country again, or you felt okay? Maybe it's you would enjoy the time with the relaxing environment in Switzerland for a bit, and then moving again. How was your mindset back then?
At the time, I sort of was thinking a bit more about, okay, the role in Switzerland and assuming I'd be there 2 or 3 years, which is actually the way it ended up. But obviously, whenever you start a new role, the first few months are getting your head into that role, understanding, what it's about, where are the gaps, where are the opportunities, what do you want your legacy to be? I remember when I landed in Geneva Airport and I caught the taxi to my short-term accommodation that they were putting me up in. And there were two things that struck me. One was the price of the taxi. It was like, oh my goodness, before I'd even left the airport, it was more than I'd spent on any taxi or rickshaw in India in my whole 3.5 years there. So it reminded me, how expensive the place is. And the second thing is I remember asking the taxi driver, look, I'm moving here. What would be your top advice for fitting into Switzerland? And he said, follow the rules. I remember that very, very specifically. And of course, I learned over the coming weeks and months that there are a lot of rules in Switzerland for sure. There are actually a lot of rules in India as well, but not everyone always follows them. It has to be said. In Switzerland, they do follow them. Lots of crazy rules, like you can't flush your toilet after 10 o'clock at night, for example, if you're sitting in an apartment block. I got myself into a bit of trouble for not cutting my grass, which offended the neighbours. Can't do anything on a Sunday work-wise. There's all sorts of different rules in Switzerland that took a bit of adjusting to, and that was certainly very different to what I've been used to.
The sensitivity to noise and collective awareness, like recycling, vacuum cleaners on Sundays, and laundry to washing machine. Yeah, and
putting the right stuff in the right recycling bin is a major challenge.
Yeah,
people are watching you, taking photos if you get it wrong. So there was also a lot of pressure.
How did you? How was that work with Nestle, and how did you manage it? Any challenges you faced taking that new role?
Yeah, so India was very fast paced, very dynamic. Things happen straight away. I tell a story in the book about how we arranged a celebration party within about 24 hours, whereas in the UK that would have taken 3 weeks to organise. Things move fast. In Switzerland, they don't move so fast. So you've got to readjust, a little bit to a slightly different pace. Personally, I found it fantastic to reconnect with clients at a much deeper level. So I was actually based on site at Nestle in Vevey. So actually reconnecting with the full client organization was fantastic. But my major reason, obviously, for doing it was to learn how to lead virtual teams around the globe. So how do you get people that aren't reporting directly into you, because in the Nielsen structure, they would report into the local country managers and have a dotted line into me. So how do you get all these resources that you're not technically managing around the world excited about what you're trying to do with Nestle? So that was a big part of my learning. How do you, again, make them feel part of that success? How do you get everyone on side? I learned that it's not just about working with my team around the world, it's actually working with their bosses as well. So get to know the country managers and really pitching why Nestle is such a big opportunity for them as well, so that they would also, release enough time. So a lot of it was about how do you get the right mindset globally amongst different teams. And a lot of it was about connecting to the client's agenda as well. So Nestle was getting very digital at the time. So that was a big theme. They were looking at developing markets in a big way. So really rallying around those clients' needs. And, a big focus for me was actually how do I make Nestle the biggest global client for Nielsen? It was the third biggest when I took on the role. And I was really pleased that over the 3 years that I was there, we actually made it Nielsen's biggest single client, which was, sort of a big thing for me and also a big thing for the team as well. And we obviously celebrated pretty hard when we made that happen.
That's a great story. I want to also have a look back at these stories. And it feels now, looking back, that all these steps were somehow quite clearly and intentionally planned for your career development. You moved to Australia, moving back to the UK, and then India, very challenging but fast-paced, but also a lot of things that you could learn, and leadership as well. And then taking a global account, very strategic. How do you see that? Do you think it was intentional?
Yeah, look, Kevin, that's a really important point, because if you think about all the moves that I've talked about, with the exception of India, in fairness, because I think that was more the global CEO and global head of HR recognizing I needed to learn about developing markets. With that, apart from that one exception, everything else was quite intentional. I found myself sort of sitting down at various points in time, reflecting on my career to date and thinking about where my gaps were from a learning and a leadership perspective. And then really thinking about how could I fill those gaps. And that was a lot of the motivation for all of the moves that I've done. And most of the moves as well, coming into the future, have been into new areas of learning. So I think a lot of people do make the mistake of sitting back, expecting their bosses to really be thinking deeply about their needs and how can they develop their career. The reality is that doesn't always happen. Human nature is that bosses are thinking about all sorts of other things. Sometimes they want to keep you in your role as well, honestly, and you have to push and fight a little bit, to actually sort of be given the opportunity to go elsewhere. So certainly a big piece of advice I would say for anyone, certainly looking for an international career, but even more generally, how do you develop in whatever you're looking to do, is you've got to take control of that journey yourself. Try and give your boss plenty of notice. That's the way to do it, but be quite clear about what you'd like to do and quite open and make it happen yourself. That's really a big message.
And to which extent it is more of a two sides collaboration when it comes to this career planning? Is it more you have been in full control of filling these gaps, or you have been constantly hand in hand with a mentor or someone who will actually also help you out in planning these steps?
Having mentors is very important. So I have had people that I go to for advice throughout my career. So checking in, how do they think I'm doing, sort of where do they think about my career? So I think having people that you can go to that are removed from your day-to-day work is really, really important. And I certainly had people that I would talk to about that. But as I say, I think a lot of it is really you've got to think about it yourself. You've got to be constantly talking and networking and, sort of working out where your gaps are. The annual performance appraisals are always good opportunities to have proper conversations about how you're feeling and, sort of what you need to develop. And they often lead into conversations about where could you go next. A lot of it, I think, has to come from within. Certainly in my case, that was the case.
In China, do you feel like there has been a bit of a difference when it comes to your team members, hoping that you would plan the career for them?
Yes, for sure. I mean, certainly in China, to a certain extent in India as well, but particularly in China, as you say, people really expect their boss to be looking after them and to be thinking about their salary, their opportunities, their career next steps. I remember when I first went to China, I had a new leader assimilation on my first day. And there were lots of questions came in. One of them was, how do we gain your trust? And I sort of said at the time, my trust starts at 100% already and it can only go down. But, I'm going to trust you to start with. And people just couldn't understand that because that was quite different to how a lot of the team in China thought. They felt that they had to build trust. And they certainly didn't give 100% trust to their leaders in the way that I was talking. You had to sort of show that you were thinking about the team, that you were protecting them if need be from, sort of global, that you were sort of giving them the right praise. And as you built that trust, and it did take time, once you built that trust, the teams were just incredible. They would run through brick walls for you, but they did expect you, to your point, to really be thinking about them. And so they didn't feel necessarily able to come and sort of say, look, I feel like I'm ready for such a role, or I'd like to do such and such. They relied on you being very close to their needs and finding those opportunities. So that's a very important nuance that you bring out. That's quite different from some of the Western countries that I worked in, where it is a bit more on the individual. Certainly in China, they're expecting their boss to be a lot more cognizant of that. And that's a really important rule for Western leaders as well. Come in, you've got to play that additional role in a much bigger way than you probably be used to playing it in other markets.
There is also this misconception that given the Chinese culture to be quite top-down, that the team members would be more compliant to the boss. But have you felt that you still need to deliver results, otherwise that they will also challenge you?
They will. Again, China is such a high-performing economy. People want to be in roles which are really being very successful. So if their boss is not performing or the team is not growing, they can lose confidence in their boss quite quickly. And that can also manifest itself in them looking for other opportunities as well. And you tend to find there's a very strong team dynamic in China as well. So if one key team member goes, then quite often the whole team will go as well. So they really look on their boss to be driving the right sets of initiatives, to be handling global stakeholders in the right way. So on the face of it, it can be quite hierarchical. So you won't always get that face-to-face feedback, but you will start seeing it in terms of things not necessarily being done that you think should be done, team members doing other stuff. I often talk about this concept called the meeting outside the meeting in China. So when I first went there, we would have a meeting and I would feel that decisions had been made. And then I would realize afterwards that actually not everyone agreed with the decision or what I'd said, but they didn't feel able to talk about it in the meeting. So there was a meeting outside the meeting where all the team would meet again, apart from me, and they would rediscuss it. And they would often come up with a different viewpoint. And then one brave soul would basically come and talk to me, about what the team really felt. And that to me was a really interesting sort of interesting process. So yeah, I don't think people are just going to blindly do stuff in China. They have to believe in it, and they will find different ways, even if they're not confident enough to directly confront you in a meeting. They will find ways of getting that point across and getting you to change your mind. You just got to be open. You just got to be open to those types of approaches.
There are more things at stake when you have a client meeting and things seems to be agreed, but at the face of it, not really. Did you also see this situation happening?
Sometimes, yeah. I mean, face is obviously a really important concept in China and India. So people don't want to be disrespected. So if I come in as the more senior player, even to a client who's buying stuff off us, or hoping we'll buy stuff off us, if they don't agree, they might not necessarily say no there and then because they don't want to offend me, particularly if I'm in front of the team. So on many occasions, I would come out of these client meetings and say to the team, "That's great. Looks like we're going to get that sale. It's pretty much an easy next step." And they would educate me that no. If you listen carefully, they were politely putting across different reasons, different blockers, and they didn't say no. But in reality, they're not going to go ahead. They just were too polite to actually tell you. So you've really got to pick up on those cues. Again, you've got to trust your team as well to be able to tell you, what those cues are and how you can address them. So yeah, that face idea, I mean, it's a great thing, I think, about particularly a lot of Eastern markets. It is good to be respectful and kind and, but it makes it a little bit more difficult to, understand what people are really thinking. And obviously very different to US culture and Australian culture, for example, where people are going to tell you exactly what they think, whether you like it or not. So at least you know where you stand. So you've got to be a lot more nuanced in those markets and take the time to really, really look at the different cues which are coming out.
You have not listed the UK when it comes to the more forward culture. Do you feel that the UK culture also has this a bit more implicit, this phase, and not being too confrontational in this situation as well, similar to the Eastern cultures?
I think it's somewhere in between the US, Australia, and India, China. Obviously, there are exceptions to the rule here, by the way. I hate to generalize the whole group of people because obviously everyone's different. But from my experience in the UK, people are a bit more polite. They don't want to offend. They can be direct, but they'll sometimes use language which doesn't make it immediately obvious. And I was guilty of that. I would use a lot of British language. In the UK, if someone would come to me with a proposal that I thought was a long way off what it needed to be, I would say, look, that needs a bit of work. That's what I would say. And people in the UK would understand that it needs a rewrite. I remember, in India and China, actually, particularly in India, because that was my first experience in developing markets, people would come to me and I'd say that needs a bit of work. And then they would come back the next week and one word would be changed. They literally took it very literally. So I had to learn to be a lot more direct in my language. I got better about it over time. But I think, a lot of Brits going abroad for the first time, do fall foul of this. They use language which is not clear. They don't want to offend people. It's actually quite difficult to offend people. You do have to be quite direct. So yeah, somewhere in the middle, I would say, the Brits are.
You're talking in your book of cultural intelligence. Maybe you can tell us more about this. How do you define cultural intelligence?
There are lots of academic and theoretical definitions, clearly, of cultural intelligence. To me, it's about, as a leader, being open to really understanding where someone is coming from and understanding what is important to them. And I've seen lots of examples over my career where leaders have gone into international assignments or led virtual teams and they just haven't had that mindset. They haven't flexed their style. They've assumed that they know better than everyone else because they're more senior. You know, they haven't read the cues from the team. They haven't taken the time to understand who needs some hand-holding, who needs to build a relationship and who doesn't. So to me, cultural intelligence is about stepping back and really taking the time to understand what is important to people, first and foremost. And then obviously you get sort of, cultural characteristics that tend to flow through a lot of these types of conversations. So I'm a big believer that if you can really listen and empathize and be adaptable yourself to different people and different cultures, then you will get better outcomes. And I'm really a passionate believer in that. I've seen that throughout my career. I think if you're not adaptable, if you don't show that cultural intelligence, you might be able to drive things in the short term, but you won't get that trust, you won't get the relationships built, and you won't build long-term success. So that's really what I mean when I'm talking about cultural intelligence. Does that make sense?
Yes. Why not? Why not? Can't you build long-term success if you cannot display or show a certain level of cultural intelligence? Any situation you've seen, like among peers, or they cared about performance short term, and in the end,
I've seen plenty of leaders go into some of these markets and take a very Western approach to leadership. So I'm thinking of one example in the last year or two where we had a leader who would go into India, for example, would be very tough, would shout at people in the team meeting, would put a lot of pressure on people. And in the short term, sort of people would run around because they were a bit fearful, frankly, of their jobs and what would happen, if they didn't actually do what this boss was saying. But what happened over time, unsurprisingly, is that these people didn't want to work for this boss. They were doing stuff in the short term, even if it wasn't necessarily the right thing for the medium term, but they weren't able to talk back to the boss to explain. The trust wasn't there. So as a result, those short-term wins didn't manifest itself into long-term sustainable advantage. And those people in particular were doing the minimum necessary. They weren't willing to go the extra mile, which is so important in a lot of markets to make things happen. So that's just one example of how I'm thinking that, you might get some short-term things done, but, you're not going to be necessarily successful in the medium term unless you really understand and culturally adapt. It doesn't mean you need to change your style completely, by the way, because you don't want to obviously change your values. And there are lots of things about being direct in communication and holding people to high standards, which you shouldn't compromise on. But, adapting around those other factors is the way that you engender trust and, build sort of more sustainable results, in my opinion.
But you also see situations where in the short term, performance do not work out because of a lack of cultural intelligence, empathy, and connections with different parties.
Yes, absolutely. Communication is obviously a really big one. You see that all the time. Sort of differences in communication approach, and people might be talking about the same thing, but they're approaching it in different ways. You see a lot of misalignment around what is really important. If you're not taking the time to really, sort of understand different points of view. So, and you can waste a lot of energy as well. One of the common mistakes I see, particularly amongst people leading virtual teams, is that virtual global teams is they're only listening to the viewpoints of people who are used to talking on conference calls. So certain nationalities are more generally happy to do that, whereas often a lot of the real value and the insight, and frankly, a lot of the real business impact comes from people who were brought up to not necessarily talk openly, but only talk when spoken to. So, leaders have to find a way of bringing those people into the conversation and making them feel confident enough that their viewpoints are really important as well. So I think leaders have to sort of really think very carefully about how do you interact with different types of people. Otherwise, even in the short term, as you say, things can rapidly go awry.
You mentioned about leading virtually. Do you see some leadership traits that are being lost in the future generation, and what do you think could be the consequences of it, and how to build that up again?
Yeah, yes, COVID obviously, and now remote working being the norm, have rapidly changed, obviously, the way that leadership works. In the short term, I think there are probably benefits because People had to learn more about, sort of communicating in different ways. You had to sort of probably establish a bit more trust with people because they weren't necessarily in front of you every day that you could see. So you had to learn to empower and trust people and sort of judge people a bit more by outcomes rather than necessarily inputs. You had to learn to get a lot better communicating when you're on a Zoom call, and you don't have the informal conversations that come with, sort of being there face to face. So I think in the short term, there were lots of benefits, but I think over time, particularly with workforces which hardly spend any time together in the office, then a lot of those connections can be lost. A lot of the relationships are much more transactional. For example, we talked before about people going the extra mile and understanding where people are coming from, the more time they spend together. If it's only, piecemeal around different topics on voice, or digital calls, then you don't build up that sort of trust. And a lot of leaders, myself included, learnt by observing other people as well. So I would see how people early on in my career would handle conflict in meetings or would sort of lead a town hall. You don't see that necessarily day to day when you're just sort of, coming in on a remote basis. So some of those skills are, in danger of being lost a little bit. So yeah, I think it's sort of, those are some of the things I think that leaders coming through that, particularly the last 4 or 5 years, have to be aware of. So, and I think from a, sort of a placing people in roles, again, it comes back to identifying where some of those gaps are. I think leaders probably have to think about their teams and where are some of the gaps and how do you bridge them, sort of maybe in very different environments or maybe through other sort of, one-on-one coaching or, other types of means as well. So yeah, it's a very different sort of set of characteristics nowadays.
And now you have your advisory, and what are the usual topics that they consult you? What are the main pain points that you feel?
A lot of my advisory work is with data companies at the moment. I work with some FMCG companies as well. Obviously, growing in a very disrupted environment is really the overall theme. Growth has become more difficult for a lot of companies, and the whole world of AI and technology is a huge risk to a lot of companies and an opportunity to others. So I think probably the single biggest theme, unsurprisingly, coming through at the moment is how do we sort of lean into this revolution? How can we take advantage of it, and how can we sort of basically be wary of it as well? What do we need to look out for? How do we identify brand new competitors on the horizon that we haven't even thought of at the moment? How do we commercialize our offerings in a new AI type world? So I think a lot of the themes are in that area, and clearly talent lies pretty close to that as well. What are the type of people that can help us here? How do we drive this transformation in a way that people understand? So how can you have some of the technical know-how and skills, but you still have sort of the change management skills as well, which are often very different, as you know, very, very different types of skills. So a lot of the conversation with boards in particular is around how do you find these sort of people, and what's the right roadmap for our particular business.
And how do you connect that to cultural intelligence?
It's a lot about change and transformation at the moment, and I think when change and transformation is the priority, then understanding cultural nuances and what is different about a particular country versus another country becomes absolutely critical to a change and transformation initiative. So I think if you just sort of sit there and develop some tech and roll it out globally without really understanding, the cultural differences, then I think the risks are much, much higher. So I think, when you have the status quo, ironically, it's maybe a little bit easier and maybe it's a little less critical cultural intelligence. But I think when you go through rapid periods of change, which is what is happening in pretty much every industry right now, that's when you really need to understand, I think, the different factors. And also getting people on board clearly is really key. So cultural intelligence, sort of get people excited, get people on board, getting people to be very open about what's working and what's not working. This is really where I see the importance coming through very strongly.
And then you decided to write this book. It does reflect what leadership is about when it comes to being exceptionally human, across border, cross culture. You definitely display, and I think this is part of your humor, but also you don't shy away with the difficult times that you had in your life. You mentioned losing your wife, and how did you find this confidence to be so open?
Yes, look, I think I've definitely become more open over time, partly for some of the reasons we've talked about today, that you can get misunderstood if you're not. And also takes a lot longer to get to the heart of different issues if you're not open. I think I was probably more guarded and more risk averse when I was younger, but some of these very difficult experiences that I've gone through, and obviously a lot of difficult work experiences as well, because lots of things have gone wrong in work. I mean, we've talked about some of the successes here, but I've lost clients, and all sorts of things have happened as well. But I think sort of being very open about those types of experiences can also help other people recognize that it's not always a perfect upward trajectory. A lot of it is about how do you pick yourself up from very, very difficult circumstances. That's a lot of what I think leadership learning is all about. And the human side, I think, is key. And again, it comes back to, dominating now is AI and tech, but, this is human, and people can feel, very left out of things, very unloved if you're not careful, and actually making sure your teams are engaged and still see a fantastic future is a very, very human thing. And you have to have human leaders, I think, that can connect with different people to be able to drive that confidence. So that's really a big theme in the book as well. How do you become more of a human and open leader?
When I talk to international companies, it's becoming harder to find a new generation of leaders who wants to go abroad and lead in different markets. To close this conversation, do you have any advice for the new generation of leaders when it comes to international career, whether it makes sense or not?
There's a lot of things happening globally at the moment. Everyone knows about the geopolitical situations, which on the face of it are making arguably the world a little bit more divided than they used to be. That said, with technology in particular, global connectedness, particularly within multinationals and within businesses, is still absolutely critical. And even if supply chains and other factors might change a little bit, workforces are going to continue to leverage their global talent in the best possible way. So I think, new generations of leaders have to be very good at using, obviously, technology to connect with people, but they have to be very, very good at sort of understanding sort of what their global talent is and is not doing, because if you can really have your pulse on that, then you're basically going to be able to put the best people in the right types of roles and achieve much greater things than you would be by putting people that you just know who are in your same country on those particular tasks. And we all know that there are fantastic talent. So I think the new generation of leaders needs to be very attuned to that and needs to find a way of unlocking a lot of that potential.
And last question, would you consider yourself more of an optimistic for the future to come? How do you feel about all of this?
If you read my book, I do talk about what happens if World War III breaks out, but it's only a brief. Overall, I am optimistic because I do think if we step back, there's still incredible progress being made in the world. I do think we're at a bit of a point in time at the moment for various reasons that things are a lot more tense, but I think leadership's going to adapt. I think people are going to realize, what's important. And I am optimistic that more globalization is going to happen in the future. There might be a few bumps in the road as different countries become stronger and a bit weaker. But overall, I am optimistic that, progress is going to continue and there's going to be lots more opportunities for people in the future.
Justin, thank you for bringing so much honesty and depth to this conversation. For anyone who wants to go deeper, we will link the Beyond Borders, Beyond Beliefs, and to Justin Advisory and Speaking Work in the show notes. Justin, thank you again for joining.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you for listening to Leaders in Motion. And if you want to go further, join the Leaders in Motion Academy, our executive program. The first step is simple. Subscribe to our newsletter in the show notes, and you'll get access to our exclusive insights and all the details about the Academy. This podcast is produced by Melanie Hong, who helps leaders and organizations create strategic podcasts. I'm Kevin Hong, and see you next time.